Hey guys, tonight we follow the rise and spectacular collapse of the Crusader military orders, the legendary warrior monks who somehow convinced medieval Europe that taking vows of poverty while living in enormous castles was a perfectly sensible life choice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the Crusader military orders begins with a contradiction so remarkable that it probably left medieval job recruiters scratching their heads. Monks were expected to pray, fast, copy manuscripts, and generally avoid hitting people with sharp objects. Knights, meanwhile, solved most of life's problems by charging at them on horseback. Somehow, medieval Europe looked at these two completely different professions and concluded, why not combine them? Their origins lay in the aftermath of the First Crusade. In the year 1099, Christian armies captured Jerusalem after a long and brutal campaign. Soon afterward, thousands of pilgrims from every corner of Europe began making the journey to the Holy Land. Visiting the sacred sites was considered an act of immense devotion. Actually reaching them alive was considered an impressive bonus. The roads leading to Jerusalem were dangerous. Bandits lurked in mountain passes. Rival armies controlled sections of the route, and local politics changed almost as often as medieval weather forecasts, which is to say, nobody really knew what would happen next. A pilgrim might leave France full of faith and arrive in the Levant considerably poorer, thoroughly exhausted, and wondering why no one had mentioned the robbers in the travel brochure. To solve this growing problem, religious brotherhoods began organising themselves to care for travellers. Some established hospitals for the sick and wounded. Others escorted pilgrims through dangerous territory. Before long, these communities received papal approval to carry weapons while continuing to live under strict monastic vows. They promised poverty, chastity, and obedience, while simultaneously becoming some of the finest cavalrymen in Christendom. It was a rather unusual lifestyle. Imagine taking vows of humility before spending the afternoon practicing cavalry charges in polished armour. Among the earliest and most famous were the Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims travelling between the coast and Jerusalem. The Knights Hospitaller, who had begun as caregivers for the sick, gradually transformed into an elite military force. Later came the Teutonic Knights, originally created to assist German pilgrims, before developing ambitions that extended well beyond hospitality. Other orders, including St. Lazarus, Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, and the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, would soon emerge, each with its own mission, but sharing the same extraordinary combination of faith and warfare. What truly set these orders apart, however, was not merely their military skill. They answered directly to the Pope instead of local kings or feudal lords. This granted them unusual independence at a time when nearly everyone answered to somebody. Donations poured in from across Europe. Noble families gifted them castles, farmland, vineyards, mills, forests, and entire villages. Wealthy crusaders leaving for the east often entrusted their estates to the orders, confident that warrior monks were less likely to disappear with the family silver than certain ambitious cousins. If one military order best captures the dramatic rise and equally dramatic fall of the Crusades, it is undoubtedly the Knights Templar. Their story begins modestly enough, with only 9 knights pledging to protect pilgrims in Jerusalem. By the time it ended nearly 2 centuries later, they had become one of the richest institutions in Europe and one of the most feared. As it turns out, combining enormous wealth with political independence is an excellent way to attract attention from kings who are deeply in debt. The Templars were officially founded around the year 1119 by the French knight Hugues de Payan and several companions. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, believed to be near the site of Solomon's Temple. From this location came their famous name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon. It was a wonderfully humble title, although the poor part would not age particularly well. Under the guidance of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the order received papal approval and quickly became one of the most respected organisations in Christendom. Bernard praised the Templars as holy warriors whose battles were fought not for glory or personal gain, but in defence of the faith. His endorsement carried enormous influence. Noble families across Europe eagerly donated land, livestock, money and castles to support the order. Within a few decades, the Templars had established commanderies stretching from England and Scotland to Portugal, Italy and the Holy Land. These estates generated steady income through farming, vineyards, mills and trade. Unlike many feudal lords, the Templars managed their properties with remarkable efficiency. Medieval accounting may not sound exciting, but it can quietly build an empire. Their financial innovations became just as important as their military achievements. Pilgrims travelling to Jerusalem could deposit money at a Templar house in France and receive a coded document allowing them to withdraw funds in the East. This reduced the risk of carrying large amounts of gold across dangerous roads. In effect, the Templars had created one of Europe's earliest international banking systems centuries before anyone had ever complained about banking fees. On the battlefield, they earned a fearsome reputation. Templar knights wore distinctive white mantles marked with a red cross and followed strict discipline. Retreat without orders was forbidden, except under extraordinary circumstances. During major engagements, they often formed the elite reserve or spearheaded devastating cavalry charges. Muslim chroniclers respected their courage even while regarding them as relentless enemies. Yet the very success that elevated the Templars also planted the seeds of their destruction. Their castles, vast estates, financial influence, and exemption from royal authority made them appear almost like a state within a state. After the Crusaders lost Acre in 1291, and the Holy Land slipped permanently from Christian control, many Europeans quietly began asking an uncomfortable question. If the Crusades were over, why did the Templars still possess so much power? That question would soon receive an answer no one in the order expected. By the beginning of the 14th century, the Knights Templar still possessed enormous wealth, impressive fortresses, and an unmatched reputation. There was only one problem. The Crusades that had justified their existence were largely over. The loss of Acre in 1291 had driven the remaining Crusaders from the Holy Land. The Templars relocated their headquarters to Cyprus, where they debated ambitious plans for a new crusade. Maps were drawn, fleets were discussed, committees were formed. Like many grand medieval projects, everyone agreed something should be done, provided someone else paid for it. Meanwhile, back in Europe, a far more immediate threat was taking shape. King Philip IV of France had spent years fighting expensive wars against England and Flanders. Wars were costly. Royal treasuries emptied quickly, while soldiers had the inconvenient habit of expecting payment. Philip desperately needed money, and unfortunately for the Templars, they possessed rather a lot of it. The king had already shown he was willing to take extreme measures against wealthy groups. He had expelled Jewish communities from France and confiscated much of their property. He had also clashed repeatedly with the papacy over taxation and royal authority. The Templars, wealthy, independent, and answerable only to the Pope, looked increasingly less like loyal servants of God and more like an attractive financial solution. Rumours about the order had circulated for years. because Templar ceremonies were secret, outsiders filled the silence with speculation. Stories spread that new members denied Christ during initiation, worshipped mysterious idols, spat on crosses, and engaged in shocking rituals. There was little credible evidence for these claims, but medieval gossip travelled remarkably well without requiring proof. Some things never change. Philip saw an opportunity. In complete secrecy, royal officials prepared coordinated arrest warrants across France. Every local officer received sealed instructions that were not to be opened until the same morning. That morning was Friday, October the 13th, 1307. At dawn, royal soldiers fanned out across the kingdom. Hundreds of Templars were arrested simultaneously before they had any chance to organise resistance. Their lands, treasures, records, and commanderies were seized almost overnight. Among those arrested was Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who had been in Paris only days earlier, attending the funeral of the king's sister-in-law. He had no reason to suspect he was walking into a carefully prepared trap. The accusations were sensational enough to shock all of Europe. Under torture, many imprisoned Templars confessed to crimes they almost certainly had never committed. Others refused to confess despite unbearable suffering. Once enough confessions had been extracted, Philip presented them as undeniable proof that the once revered order had become hopelessly corrupt. The Templars had survived battles against powerful Muslim armies for nearly 2 centuries. In the end, they were not destroyed by cavalry charges or siege engines, but by paperwork, politics, and a king whose debts had become more dangerous than any battlefield. The arrest of the Templars sent shockwaves across Europe. Kings, bishops, and ordinary people alike struggled to believe that the same knights who had defended pilgrims and fought for generations in the Holy Land were suddenly being accused of heresy, blasphemy, and devil worship. Even by medieval standards, the charges sounded dramatic. It was as though someone had combined every rumour imaginable into a single court document and simply hoped nobody would ask too many questions. The greatest obstacle to King Philip IV's plan was Pope Clement V. The Templars answered directly to the Pope, not to any king. Philip technically had no authority to destroy the order on his own. But the French king applied relentless political pressure, demanding that the papacy investigate the accusations. Clement found himself trapped. If he openly defended the Templars, he risked a confrontation with the most powerful monarch in Western Europe. If he accepted Philip's claims without question, he undermined an institution that previous popes had spent nearly 2 centuries protecting. The Pope attempted to conduct a broader investigation. Across Europe, the results varied greatly. In England, Spain, Portugal, Germany, and much of Italy, investigators often found little convincing evidence of organised heresy. Many Templars were questioned, and numerous witnesses testified to the order's honourable reputation. Outside France, torture was used far less frequently, and not surprisingly, far fewer spectacular confessions appeared. It turns out people become considerably less willing to admit worshipping imaginary idols when nobody is stretching them on a rack. Philip, however, had little interest in waiting for a balanced investigation. The French trials continued, and dozens of Templars who withdrew their earlier confessions were condemned as relapsed heretics. In medieval law, changing your story after torture was apparently considered far more suspicious than the torture itself. Finally, in 1312, Pope Clement formally dissolved the Order of the Temple at the Council of Vienne. Significantly, he did not declare the order guilty of heresy as an institution. Instead, he suppressed it for what he described as the good of the Church and to preserve peace within Christendom. It was a political compromise that satisfied almost no one. Most Templar property was officially transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, although many rulers found creative reasons to delay or avoid handing everything over. castles, estates, and treasure had an unfortunate tendency to become temporarily unavailable once they entered royal possession. The final chapter came 2 years later. In 1314, Grand Master Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay were brought before a crowd in Paris. Expected to quietly accept life imprisonment, both men instead proclaimed the innocence of the order and rejected their forced confessions. Philip acted immediately. That very evening, the two elderly knights were burned at the stake on an island in the River Seine. With their deaths, the Knights Templar disappeared from history. Yet almost immediately, legends took their place. Hidden treasure, secret vaults, mysterious curses, and forgotten knowledge would keep the Templars alive in popular imagination long after the last white mantle had turned to ashes. While the Templars vanished in fire and scandal, their greatest rivals followed a very different path. The Knights Hospitaller lost everything that had made them famous: the Holy Land, their castles, and the cities they had sworn to defend, yet somehow refused to disappear. If the Templars burned out like a shooting star, the Hospitallers simply packed their belongings, climbed aboard their ships, and looked for somewhere else to fight. Their story had begun even before the First Crusade. Around the middle of the 11th century, merchants from the Italian city of Amalfi established a hospital in Jerusalem to care for sick and exhausted pilgrims. The brothers who served there had no intention of becoming soldiers. Their daily routine involved bandages, medicines, prayers, and feeding travellers. Swordsmanship was not listed among their required skills. Everything changed after the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099. As attacks against pilgrims increased, the brothers gradually took on military responsibilities alongside their charitable work. Like the Templars, they became a religious order recognised by the Pope. Unlike the Templars, however, they never abandoned their original mission. Even while building castles and leading cavalry charges, they continued operating hospitals that treated Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. Medieval warfare was brutal, but the Hospitallers occasionally reminded everyone that compassion had not entirely gone out of fashion. For nearly 2 centuries they defended the Crusader states, constructing mighty fortresses such as Crac de Chevalier, one of the greatest castles ever built. Its towering walls, massive towers, and ingenious defences impressed even Muslim commanders. One visitor reportedly remarked that taking the fortress would be nearly impossible. Naturally, medieval generals heard that as a personal challenge. Despite their determination, the tide gradually turned against the Crusader kingdoms. Muslim leaders, most famously Saladin and later the Mamluk sultans, steadily reclaimed territory. One by one, Christian strongholds fell. Finally, in 1291, the great port city of Acre collapsed after a desperate siege. The Hospitallers fought until the very end. Survivors escaped aboard ships as the last Crusader possessions in the Holy Land disappeared forever beneath enemy banners. 2 centuries of Latin rule had come to an end. For many organisations, this would have been the final chapter. Their mission had vanished. The land they existed to defend was gone, but the Hospitallers reached a different conclusion. If they could no longer defend the Holy Land, perhaps they would simply find another frontier. Their fleet sailed west across the Mediterranean toward the island of Cyprus, where they regrouped, rebuilt, and began searching for a permanent home. They had lost a kingdom, but not their discipline, their wealth, or their determination. The age of crusading in Palestine was over, yet the Hospitallers were already preparing for the next chapter of their remarkable survival. The island of Cyprus provided the Hospitallers with safety, but it could never become the permanent headquarters they needed. The Lusignan kings who ruled Cyprus welcomed the order, yet the Hospitallers remained guests rather than masters of their own destiny. After losing the Holy Land, they had little desire to depend on another ruler's hospitality. Medieval landlords, much like modern ones, occasionally had opinions about what their tenants should be doing. The solution lay farther west. Just off the coast of Asia Minor stood the island of Rhodes, a prosperous trading centre strategically positioned between Europe and the eastern Mediterranean. It was wealthy, heavily fortified, and politically divided. Beginning in 1306, the Hospitallers launched a carefully planned campaign to seize the island. Rather than winning it in one glorious battle, they captured towns, negotiated with local leaders, and gradually tightened their grip until, by 1309, Rhodes belonged to the order. For the first time in their history, the Hospitallers were no longer merely defending someone else's kingdom. They ruled one of their own. Rhodes quickly became the capital of an independent military state. The Grand Master acted almost like a prince, governing the island while maintaining the religious discipline expected of the order. The knights organised themselves into langues, or linguistic divisions, representing regions such as France, England, Germany, Italy, Aragon, and Provence. Each lang managed its own responsibilities while contributing to the defence of the island. It was an impressively organised system, although meetings probably involved several people insisting their language was the easiest to understand. The Hospitallers transformed Rhodes into one of the strongest fortresses in Europe. Gigantic stone walls surrounded the city. Massive towers overlooked the harbour. Storehouses filled with grain, weapons and fresh water prepared the island for long sieges. Shipyards built and repaired galleys that patrolled the surrounding seas. The order also embraced naval warfare. Unlike the Templars, whose strength had primarily been cavalry, the Hospitallers became one of the Mediterranean's most formidable maritime powers. Their fleet protected Christian shipping, raided hostile ports, and attacked Muslim vessels carrying soldiers or supplies. Depending on which side of the sea you happened to live, they were either courageous defenders of Christendom or extremely well-armed pirates. Their growing naval strength inevitably attracted the attention of a rising empire. The Ottoman Turks were expanding rapidly across southeastern Europe and Anatolia. By the 15th century, they had become the dominant Muslim power in the region. Rhodes, sitting directly along important Ottoman sea routes, represented both a strategic obstacle and an irritating reminder that the crusading spirit had not entirely disappeared. The confrontation was unavoidable. Soon, the Hospitallers would face the greatest sieges in their history, not in Jerusalem or Acre, but behind the towering walls of Rhodes, where the fate of the order would once again hang in the balance. For more than 2 centuries, the walls of Rhodes had stood as a symbol of Christian resistance in the eastern Mediterranean. Merchant ships entering the harbour saw towering fortifications flying the white cross of the Hospitallers, while Ottoman captains saw something rather less inspiring, a heavily armed obstacle sitting directly across one of their busiest sea lanes. The first major attempt to seize the island came in 1480. Sultan Mehmed II, fresh from conquering Constantinople less than 3 decades earlier, believed Rhodes would fall quickly. After all, he had taken one of the greatest cities in the world. Surely one island fortress would not prove much more troublesome. It did. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers landed on Rhodes and laid siege to the city. Cannon battered the walls day after day, opening breaches that seemed impossible to defend. Yet every time the attackers surged forward, the Hospitallers fought them back with relentless determination. Knights, mercenaries, townspeople, and even civilians worked together to repair damaged walls during the night, only to watch them crumble again the following morning. Medieval home maintenance was unusually stressful. After months of fierce fighting and heavy casualties, the Ottomans withdrew. Rhodes had survived. But survival did not mean safety. Over the next 40 years, the Ottoman Empire continued expanding under a new generation of rulers. Its armies grew larger, its navy stronger, and its resources nearly unmatched. Eventually, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent decided it was time to finish what his predecessor had started. In 1522, an enormous Ottoman force arrived before Rhodes. Contemporary estimates vary wildly, but historians agree that the invaders vastly outnumbered the defenders. The Hospitallers could field only a few hundred knights, supported by several thousand soldiers and local militia. Against them stood one of the most powerful armies in the world. For 6 exhausting months, Rhodes endured constant bombardment. Ottoman artillery pounded the walls with unprecedented force. Sappers tunnelled beneath the fortifications, packing underground mines with gunpowder in an effort to collapse entire sections of the defences. The Hospitallers responded by digging countermines, creating a deadly underground struggle where explosions and hand-to-hand combat unfolded beneath the streets themselves. Every breach became another battlefield. Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam personally inspected the defences each day, encouraging exhausted defenders who were running dangerously low on food, ammunition, and healthy men. Disease spread through the crowded city. Entire districts lay in ruins. By December, further resistance had become impossible. Rather than allow a final massacre, the Grand Master negotiated honourable terms with Suleiman. The surviving knights were permitted to leave Rhodes with their weapons, banners, and remaining ships. It was an extraordinary gesture from a victorious sultan toward an enemy he deeply respected. The Hospitallers sailed away after more than 200 years on Rhodes. Once again, they had lost their home. Once again, many assumed their remarkable story had finally come to an end. Once again, they were wrong. After abandoning Rhodes in 1523, the Hospitallers found themselves in a strangely familiar position. Once again they were homeless. Once again they possessed experienced knights, a respected name, and a fleet of warships, but no territory to rule. For 7 years they wandered between European ports, relying on the goodwill of friendly rulers while searching for a permanent base. It was an awkward arrangement. An army without a homeland is much like a ship without an anchor. It can survive for a while, but eventually it needs somewhere to stop. Their opportunity arrived in 1530. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered the order the islands of Malta and Gozo, along with the North African port of Tripoli. The agreement came with one symbolic condition. Each year the knights would present the Viceroy of Sicily with a single trained falcon as payment for the islands. Compared with the vast wealth the Hospitallers once controlled, the annual rent was remarkably affordable. Medieval real estate occasionally offered excellent long-term leases. At first, many knights considered Malta a disappointment. Unlike fertile Rhodes, Malta was rocky, dry, and lacked abundant fresh water. Its natural resources were limited, and its towns were relatively small. But what Malta lacked in comfort, it made up for in strategic value. Sitting near the centre of the Mediterranean, it allowed the Hospitallers to monitor shipping between the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. The knights immediately began strengthening the island's defences. New forts rose along the harbours, artillery batteries guarded the coastline, and the Order's fleet continued attacking Ottoman shipping. Their raids captured enemy vessels, rescued Christian captives, and disrupted Muslim trade. Naturally, the Ottoman sultans viewed these activities somewhat differently. The inevitable confrontation arrived in 1565. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent assembled one of the largest invasion forces of the century. His objective was simple: erase the Hospitallers once and for all. While the Templars met a fiery end and the Hospitallers fought to keep their islands, the Teutonic Knights followed an entirely different path. They did not simply defend a kingdom, they built one from the ground up. For a time, it seemed they had discovered the perfect formula for survival. Unfortunately, history has a habit of finding flaws in perfect formulas. The Teutonic Order was founded during the Third Crusade in the city of Acre around the year 1190. Like the Hospitallers, it began as a charitable hospital serving German pilgrims wounded during the fighting. The brothers cared for the sick, distributed food, and provided shelter to travellers. Within only a few years, however, the order evolved into a military organisation, adopting many of the same rules that had made the Templars so successful. Unlike the Templars, though, the Teutonic Knights never became the dominant force in the Holy Land. By the early 13th century, the Crusader states were steadily shrinking, and opportunities for expansion were becoming scarce. Then an invitation arrived that would change everything. Duke Conrad of Masovia, a Polish ruler whose northern frontier suffered constant raids from pagan Prussian tribes, asked the Teutonic Knights for help. In 1226, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II granted the order extensive privileges through the Golden Bull of Rimini, allowing the knights to conquer and govern any pagan lands they captured. The Teutonic Knights accepted with enthusiasm. Rather than defending someone else's territory, they would create their own. Over the following decades, they launched a relentless campaign across Prussia. One by one, pagan strongholds fell. Forests were cleared, castles rose from stone and brick, and German settlers arrived to establish new towns. The order founded cities such as Königsberg and expanded others, encouraging trade, farming, and commerce alongside military conquest. The conquered Prussian tribes resisted fiercely. Some revolted repeatedly, forcing the knights into long and brutal campaigns that lasted for generations. Victory came slowly, but eventually the Teutonic Order established complete control over much of the Baltic coast. Unlike most religious orders, the Teutonic Knights now ruled a genuine state. They collected taxes, minted coins, administered justice, negotiated with foreign rulers, and commanded a disciplined standing army. Their headquarters at Marienburg Castle became the largest brick fortress in Europe, an immense complex whose towering walls projected both wealth and authority. Every summer, noblemen from across Western Europe travelled to Prussia to join the Order's campaigns against remaining pagan tribes. Fighting alongside the Teutonic Knights became almost fashionable among Europe's aristocracy. It offered adventure, prestige, and the comforting belief that one was serving both God and glory at the same time. By the beginning of the 15th century, the Teutonic Order stood at the height of its power. It possessed a wealthy kingdom, formidable armies, and nearly unchallenged influence throughout the Baltic. But just beyond its borders, two neighbouring powers were growing stronger. Poland and Lithuania were about to unite, and together they would become the greatest threat the Teutonic Knights had ever faced. For decades, the Teutonic Knights had appeared almost unstoppable. Their castles dominated the Baltic coastline. Their armies were among the best disciplined in Europe, and their reputation attracted noble volunteers from England, France, Germany, and beyond. Fighting alongside the Order was considered both honourable and adventurous. Medieval tourism, it seems, occasionally involved siege warfare. But the Teutonic Knights had a problem they struggled to accept. Their entire state had been built on fighting pagan neighbours. Then, in 1386, something happened that completely changed the political landscape. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, converted to Christianity, married the Polish Queen Jadwiga, and became King Władysław Jagiełło of Poland. Suddenly, Lithuania, the Order's principal enemy, was officially Christian. For the Teutonic Knights, this created an uncomfortable situation. Their justification for war had always been the conversion of pagan peoples. If Lithuania was now Christian, continuing to invade its lands became much harder to explain. The Order insisted many Lithuanians remained pagan, and accused their rulers of insincere conversion. Poland, meanwhile, argued that the Knights were simply using religion as an excuse to expand their territory. The disagreement steadily escalated. Border disputes multiplied. Raids became more frequent. Diplomacy failed repeatedly. Finally, in the summer of 1410, war erupted on a scale neither side had previously witnessed. The Teutonic Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, assembled an experienced army of professional knights, mercenaries, and crusading volunteers from across Europe. Facing him stood a massive coalition led by King Jagiełło of Poland and Grand Duke Vytautas of Lithuania. Their forces included Polish heavy cavalry, Lithuanian horsemen, Czech troops, Ruthenians, and even Tatar auxiliaries. It was one of the largest armies medieval Europe had ever seen. The two sides met near the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg, and Jalgiris on the 15th of July. The battle lasted for hours beneath the summer sun. At first, the Teutonic Knights believed victory was within reach. Their armoured cavalry launched devastating charges against the Allied lines, while parts of the Lithuanian army appeared to retreat from the battlefield. Believing the enemy was breaking, many knights pursued them, but the retreat was only temporary. Lithuanian forces regrouped and returned, while the Polish cavalry maintained relentless pressure on the Teutonic centre. Gradually, the Order's disciplined formations became surrounded. Then disaster struck. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen was killed in the fighting. Around him, many of the Order's senior commanders also fell. Without their leadership, resistance began to collapse. By sunset, the battlefield was covered with thousands of dead soldiers. Much of the Teutonic leadership had been wiped out in a single day. Although the Order survived the battle itself, Grunwald shattered its aura of invincibility forever. The Teutonic Knights still possessed castles, wealth, and territory. What they had lost could never be rebuilt quite so easily. The belief that they simply could not be defeated. Although the Battle of Grunwald had nearly destroyed the Teutonic Knights, it did not immediately erase their state from the map. In fact, only weeks after the disastrous defeat, the Order managed one final display of remarkable resilience. The victorious Polish-Lithuanian army marched toward Marienburg Castle, expecting the Teutonic capital to surrender. Instead, they found its enormous red brick walls fully manned under the command of Heinrich von Plauen, a capable commander who had escaped the battlefield before the disaster unfolded. Von Plauen worked day and night preparing the defences. Supplies were gathered, damaged walls strengthened, and every available soldier was placed on alert. When the Allied army finally arrived, they faced one of the strongest fortresses in Europe. The siege dragged on for weeks, but disease, supply shortages, and approaching autumn gradually weakened the attackers. Eventually, the Polish-Lithuanian forces abandoned the siege and returned home. For the Teutonic Order, it was a temporary miracle. The first Peace of Thorn, signed in 1411, allowed the knights to survive, but at a tremendous cost. They paid enormous financial reparations, surrendered territory, and exhausted much of their treasury. To meet these obligations, the Order increased taxes across Prussia, hoping its towns and nobles would shoulder the burden. They were not pleased. For generations, merchants and local landowners had accepted the rule of the Teutonic Knights because the Order brought security, trade, and military success. Now they saw rising taxes, shrinking profits, and leaders who seemed unable to reverse their decline. The once admired warrior monks were beginning to resemble expensive landlords with increasingly poor investment strategies. Discontent spread throughout the state. Cities such as Danzig, Elbing, and Thorn became wealthier through Baltic trade and increasingly resented decisions made by the Order's leadership. Local nobles also demanded greater influence over government, something the highly centralized Teutonic administration had little interest in granting. Meanwhile, Poland and Lithuania continued growing stronger. Every conflict seemed to end slightly worse for the Teutonic Knights than the one before. More territory disappeared, more money vanished. Recruiting experienced soldiers became increasingly difficult as victories became rarer and debts multiplied. Then, in 1454, the growing frustration finally exploded. The Prussian Confederation, an alliance of nobles and wealthy cities, openly rebelled against the Teutonic Order and requested protection from King Casimir IV of Poland. What followed became known as the 13 Years' War, one of the longest and most exhausting conflicts in the Baltic. This time, the Teutonic Knights were not fighting pagan tribes or foreign invaders. they were fighting many of their own subjects. For an order built on discipline and unity, there could hardly have been a more dangerous sign that its great crusading state was beginning to fall apart from within. The 13 Years' War ended in 1466, and with it, the Teutonic Order ceased to be the dominant power of the Baltic. The Second Peace of Thorn forced the knights to surrender some of their richest and most important territories, including the prosperous cities of Danzig, Elbing, and Thorn. These lands became part of what was known as Royal Prussia, under the Polish crown. What remained of the Teutonic state was no longer truly independent. The Grand Master was now required to swear an oath of loyalty to the King of Poland. For an order that had once answered only to the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, this was a humiliating reversal. The proud warrior monks who had once negotiated with kings as equals now found themselves becoming subjects of one. Still, the order refused to accept that its glory days were over. Grand Masters continued strengthening castles, rebuilding finances, and hoping for an opportunity to restore their former power. But Europe itself was changing far too quickly. Gunpowder weapons became increasingly common, making even the strongest medieval castles less intimidating than they had once been. Professional royal armies were replacing the old system of feudal knights and religious military orders. Kings preferred soldiers they paid directly, rather than independent organizations that owned half the countryside, and occasionally reminded everyone they answered to someone else. Then came an even greater upheaval. In 1517, Martin Luther published his famous 95 Theses, igniting the Protestant Reformation. Within only a few years, religious unity across Europe began to fracture. The Teutonic Order suddenly faced a crisis unlike any it had encountered before. Its entire existence rested upon being a Catholic military order, but many of the German territories surrounding Prussia were embracing Lutheran ideas, including members of the order itself. The man who would make the most dramatic decision was Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg. Albert had spent years fighting another costly war against Poland in the hope of recovering the order's independence. The campaign failed completely. His treasury was exhausted, his army weakened, and support from the Holy Roman Empire proved disappointing. Winning the war was becoming about as realistic as rebuilding Jerusalem with good intentions alone. Searching for another solution, Albert did something almost unimaginable. He met personally with Martin Luther. Luther advised him that maintaining a monastic military state no longer made sense. Instead, Albert should dissolve the religious order's government, abandon his vows, marry, and transform Prussia into a secular duchy. For centuries, every Grand Master had dedicated his life to defending a religious order. Albert decided to end it. In 1525, he converted to Lutheranism, secularized the Teutonic state's remaining lands, and became the first Duke of Prussia. Before a large crowd in Krakow, he knelt before the King of Poland and swore fealty. Without a great battle or dramatic siege, the Crusader kingdom built by the Teutonic Knights quietly disappeared. The order itself survived, but the powerful military state it had spent 3 centuries creating had come to an end. Not every Crusader military order ended with dramatic trials, legendary sieges, or famous battles. Many simply faded away as the medieval world that had created them disappeared. Their decline was slower, quieter, and in some ways even more revealing. It showed that the greatest enemy of these organizations was not always another army. Sometimes it was irrelevance. One of the oldest was the Order of St. Lazarus. Originally founded to care for lepers in the Holy Land, the order occupied a unique place among the Crusader brotherhoods. Since leprosy was common during the Middle Ages, many of its members actually suffered from the disease themselves. Knights who could no longer serve in other military orders often found a home within St. Lazarus, where they continued both religious and military service. Despite their illness, the knights occasionally fought in battle alongside other Crusader forces. Muslim chroniclers even remarked upon their determination, knowing many of these men had little to lose. Yet after the Crusader states collapsed, the order lost the hospitals and territories that had given it purpose. Rather than disappearing overnight, St. Lazarus slowly transformed into a charitable institution under various European monarchs. by the early modern period, its military role had all but vanished. The brothers exchanged battlefields for hospitals, proving that healing people generally produces fewer diplomatic complications than charging at them with lances. A similar story unfolded in Spain. Unlike the Templars or Hospitallers, the orders of Santiago, Calatrava, Alcántara, and Montesa had been created primarily to fight the Muslim kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista. For centuries, they guarded frontiers, defended castles, and helped Christian rulers gradually expand southward. Then, in 1492, Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, finally surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella. The Reconquista was over. The military orders suddenly faced an uncomfortable question, remarkably similar to the one confronting the Templars 2 centuries earlier. If there were no longer frontiers to defend, why were these independent armies still necessary? Spain's monarchs answered that question themselves. Rather than abolishing the orders outright, Ferdinand and Isabella gradually placed them under direct royal control. Future Grand Masters were effectively chosen by the crown, and the enormous wealth of the orders became another instrument of royal authority. The brotherhoods survived on paper, but their independence quietly disappeared. By the 16th century, many knights spent far more time managing estates and attending court than campaigning across battlefields. The white cloaks and colourful crosses remained impressive, but they increasingly represented noble prestige rather than military necessity. One by one, the smaller Crusader orders adapted, merged, or surrendered their independence. They had not been defeated. They had simply outlived the world that had once made them indispensable. By the beginning of the 19th century, the age of the Crusades was long gone. Jerusalem had not been under Christian rule for centuries. Castles that once guarded holy frontiers had become tourist curiosities or crumbling ruins, and the great military orders no longer commanded armies capable of changing the course of history. Yet not all of them disappeared. Some survived by accepting a difficult truth. If they wanted to live on, they had to become something entirely different. The most remarkable example was the Knights Hospitaller. After Napoleon seized Malta in 1798, the order entered one of the most uncertain periods in its history. Without territory, many believed it would finally dissolve, just as the Templars had centuries earlier. But unlike the Templars, the Hospitallers adapted. Instead of rebuilding a military state, they gradually returned to the charitable mission that had inspired their foundation nearly 700 years earlier. Hospitals, medical care, disaster relief, and humanitarian work replaced naval battles and castle defences. Today, the sovereign military order of Malta still exists, maintaining diplomatic relations with numerous countries while operating hospitals and humanitarian missions around the world. Their knights no longer charge across battlefields. Fortunately for everyone involved, modern hospital administrators generally prefer ambulances to cavalry. The Teutonic Order followed a similar path. After losing Prussia, the order retained scattered properties within the Holy Roman Empire. It survived the Protestant Reformation, the Napoleonic Wars, and even the collapse of the empire itself. During the 19th century, its military functions disappeared almost entirely, leaving behind a Catholic religious order devoted to pastoral work, education, and charitable service. The famous white cloak with the black cross still exists. Only now, it is far more likely to be seen in a church or community centre than on a battlefield. Other military orders became honorary institutions, noble societies, or historical organisations. Some merged into newer foundations. Others vanished so gradually that historians still debate the exact moment they truly ceased to exist. Their castles, however, remained. Across Europe and the Middle East, the massive fortresses built by the Crusader orders continue to dominate landscapes centuries after the knights themselves have disappeared. Crac de Chevalier, Marienburg Castle, Rhodes, Valletta, and countless smaller strongholds still stand as reminders of an age when faith, warfare, and politics became inseparable. In the end, every major Crusader military order collapsed, not always through dramatic battles, but because the world that had created them eventually disappeared. Gunpowder replaced armoured cavalry. Nation-states replaced independent warrior monks. Diplomacy slowly overtook crusading as Europe's preferred method of solving problems. Admittedly, not always successfully. Yet their legacy endures. They transformed medieval warfare, pioneered international finance, built some of history's greatest fortresses, cared for countless pilgrims and patients, and shaped the political map of Europe for centuries. Their kingdoms fell, their armies vanished, and their crusades came to an end. But their story remains one of history's most extraordinary examples of how even the mightiest institutions must eventually adapt or be left behind by time itself. I'd like you to imagine yourself standing in the middle of a busy Ottoman neighbourhood just as dinner approaches. The afternoon heat is finally beginning to soften, and the golden light spills across rows of wooden houses, whose upper stories lean so close together they seem almost eager to exchange recipes. After a day filled with merchants shouting, blacksmiths hammering, donkeys complaining about their career choices, and children treating every alley like an official racing track, something begins to change. The streets do not become quieter exactly. They simply change their rhythm. This is dinner in a busy Ottoman neighbourhood, and unlike the hurried meals many people know today, it is an event that slowly announces itself long before the first bite is taken. The marketplace begins winding down. Shopkeepers stack bolts of cloth behind wooden shutters. Coppersmiths put away their polished hammers after hours spent shaping bowls, trays and coffee pots that now catch the evening sun like mirrors. The barber sweeps away the day's collection of trimmed beards, enough to knit a very uncomfortable blanket. Apprentices carry heavy baskets home, while exchanging gossip that somehow spreads across the neighbourhood faster than any official announcement. From nearly every chimney, pale ribbons of smoke begin curling into the sky. Then comes the scent. First, fresh bread emerging from neighbourhood ovens. Then onions slowly cooking in butter or rendered sheep fat. Soon afterward arrive garlic, parsley, cinnamon, cumin, black pepper, and the unmistakable richness of simmering lamb. Each household contributes its own aroma, until the narrow streets become one enormous invisible cookbook. Unlike wealthy imperial kitchens inside Topkapi Palace, most neighbourhood families worked with modest ingredients and careful planning. Every coin mattered. Meat might appear only occasionally, stretched across a stew instead of dominating the table. Rice remained a valued ingredient, while lentils, chickpeas, yogurt, eggplants, seasonal greens, and homemade bread formed the dependable backbone of countless meals. Dinner usually came after the day's work had finally ended. Fathers returned from workshops, docks, construction sites, gardens, or markets. Sons finished apprenticeships. Mothers had often spent much of the afternoon preparing ingredients, while balancing countless other responsibilities. Grandparents, when present, occupied honoured places within the household, while younger children eagerly hovered near the kitchen, attempting to discover whether they might earn an early taste. Sometimes they succeeded. More often they were politely chased away before stealing tomorrow's leftovers today. The neighbourhood itself reflected the remarkable diversity of the Ottoman Empire. Muslims, Christians and Jews frequently lived in adjoining quarters, each community observing its own religious customs while sharing many culinary traditions. Although dietary rules sometimes differed, the smell of slowly baking bread spoke a language everyone understood. Water carriers made their final rounds before dusk, balancing large leather bags across their shoulders. Bakers hurried to finish the last batches before the communal ovens cooled. Street cats emerged with professional confidence, fully aware that somewhere nearby an unattended fish or careless butcher would eventually provide dinner without requiring any employment whatsoever. Above it all echoed the evening call to prayer, floating from nearby minarets across tiled rooftops and crowded courtyards. For many families, this marked the transition from labour to home, from business to conversation, from public life to private comfort. As more doors opened and neighbours greeted one another across the alleys, the neighbourhood filled not only with wonderful aromas, but with anticipation. Behind each doorway, another family was gathering around its evening meal, and those kitchens are exactly where we shall step next. The delicious aromas drifting through the neighbourhood did not appear by magic. Behind nearly every wooden door stood a kitchen that served as the true heart of the Ottoman household. It was not always large, and it was rarely luxurious, but it was a place where experience mattered far more than expensive equipment. Long before recipe books became common, meals were carried in memory, passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild, one carefully watched pot at a time. Most family kitchens centered around a charcoal brazier or an open hearth. The fire demanded constant attention. Too much charcoal and the stew would boil too fiercely. Too little, and dinner might arrive well after everyone's patience had disappeared. Managing heat was considered a genuine skill, one learned through years of practice rather than precise measurements. Nobody owned a thermometer. Instead, cooks judged the fire by the colour of the glowing coals, the sound of bubbling liquid, and simple instinct developed over countless evenings. Copper cookware dominated the kitchen. Bright copper pots conducted heat beautifully, though they required frequent polishing to prevent corrosion. Larger households often owned several sizes for soups, rice dishes, vegetables and stews. Wooden spoons, clay bowls, iron knives, rolling pins, and woven baskets completed most of the equipment. Every object had multiple uses because storage space was limited, and unnecessary possessions only gathered dust. Bread was almost always the first priority. Some families baked it themselves, but many relied on communal neighbourhood ovens. Dough prepared at home would be carried through the streets to professional bakers who managed enormous brick ovens capable of serving dozens of families each day. Timing mattered. Arrive too late, and your loaf might have to wait until tomorrow. Arrive too early, and someone else's bread would still occupy the oven. Even bread had to respect a queue. Inside the kitchen, onions sizzled gently in butter or rendered fat before lentils, rice, vegetables, or meat were added. Garlic, parsley, dill, mint, cumin, cinnamon, black pepper and sumac created layers of flavour without overwhelming the ingredients themselves. Contrary to popular imagination, Ottoman cuisine was not simply about heavy spices. Balance was admired. A cook who buried every flavour beneath mountains of seasoning would receive far less praise than one who allowed each ingredient to speak for itself. Seasonality shaped every meal. Eggplants appeared in abundance during warmer months, while pumpkins, cabbages, beans, chickpeas, and root vegetables sustained households through colder seasons. Fresh herbs came from courtyard gardens whenever possible. Yogurt remained one of the kitchen's greatest treasures, served beside meals, stirred into soups, or transformed into refreshing sauces that balanced richer dishes. While women usually directed meal preparation, kitchens were rarely solitary workplaces. Older daughters learned by observing every movement. Younger children washed herbs, shelled beans or ground spices with a mortar and pestle, occasionally sampling ingredients under the highly optimistic belief that no one had noticed. Grandmothers supervised with quiet authority, sometimes correcting a granddaughter simply by raising an eyebrow. Words were often unnecessary. As more pots reached their final stages and freshly baked bread returned from the neighbourhood oven, one by one the household's separate tasks came together. The cooking was nearly complete. Now it was finally time to discover what all this careful work would become once the dishes reached the evening table. By the time every pot had finished simmering and the warm bread returned from the communal oven, the household was ready for the moment everyone had been waiting for. Dinner was not simply about satisfying hunger. It was the reward at the end of a long day's labour, a daily ritual that brought several generations together under one roof. Whether the family lived in a modest wooden home or a spacious merchant's residence, the evening meal carried a sense of rhythm that remained remarkably consistent throughout the Ottoman world. Unlike the towering dining tables that would become fashionable elsewhere in Europe, many Ottoman families ate while seated on cushions around a low, circular table known as a sofra. In simpler homes, the meal might be served directly on a large cloth spread neatly across the floor. Everyone gathered close together, creating an atmosphere that encouraged conversation rather than ceremony. The meal often began with soup. A steaming bowl of lentil soup was perhaps the most familiar sight across countless neighbourhoods. Rich without being extravagant, it filled empty stomachs while making economical use of ingredients available throughout the empire. Yogurt soups flavoured with mint appeared frequently as well, especially during warmer months, offering a comforting balance between richness and freshness. Fresh bread never sat untouched for long. Instead of forks, diners commonly used pieces of bread to scoop stews or accompany vegetables. Bread was treated with genuine respect. Wasting it was considered both careless and disrespectful, so even stale loaves found new life in soups, puddings, or other dishes the following day. The centrepiece varied according to the family's means. Wealthier households might serve tender lambs slowly braised with onions, apricots, almonds, and fragrant spices. Middle-class families often stretched smaller portions of meat into hearty stews filled with chickpeas, beans, or vegetables. Poorer households relied more heavily on legumes, grains, seasonal produce, and dairy products, creating meals that were surprisingly nourishing despite containing little or no meat. Rice occupied a place of honour. Ottoman pilaf was not merely boiled rice. Every grain was expected to remain separate, lightly coated in butter, sometimes enriched with toasted vermicelli, currants, pine nuts, or aromatic herbs. Achieving perfectly cooked pilaf required remarkable skill. A poorly prepared pilaf could quietly damage a cook's reputation far more effectively than any neighbourhood gossip. Alongside the main dishes appeared small accompaniments that completed the meal. Bowls of thick yogurt cooled spicy foods. Pickled vegetables added sharpness. Fresh herbs, cucumbers, onions, olives, and soft white cheeses offered lighter flavours that balanced richer stews. Depending on the season, roasted eggplants, stuffed vine leaves, spinach cooked with onions, or tender beans in olive oil might also appear. Contrary to modern assumptions, dinner was rarely an endless feast. Even prosperous families generally valued moderation. Hospitality demanded generosity toward guests, but everyday meals reflected practicality as much as abundance. Leftovers were welcomed rather than ignored, often becoming tomorrow's lunch with a few clever additions. Water remained the most common drink, although refreshing sherbets made from fruits, flowers, or herbs frequently accompanied the meal during special occasions or hot summer evenings. Alcohol was absent from most Muslim households, though non-Muslim communities within the empire often maintained their own traditions regarding wine. As satisfying as the food itself was, something equally important unfolded around the sofra. Dinner created a brief pause in the relentless pace of neighbourhood life, allowing stories, laughter, advice, and family news to flow as freely as the soup. Outside, however, the streets had not gone quiet. They were still alive with vendors serving those who preferred to eat beneath the evening sky. Even as families settled around their sofas indoors, many of the neighbourhood's busiest meals were still taking place outside. The narrow streets of an Ottoman city did not empty after sunset. In many ways, they became even livelier. The fading daylight softened the heat. Lanterns flickered to life beneath wooden balconies, and the smell of roasting meat drifted through the alleys like an invitation that few hungry stomachs could ignore. For labourers who had spent the day unloading ships, carrying stone, tanning leather, or hammering metal in crowded workshops, cooking at home was not always practical. Apprentices living far from their families, travelling merchants, sailors, porters and visitors all depended on the city's thriving street food culture. Fortunately, Ottoman neighbourhoods offered plenty of choices, many of them surprisingly affordable. One of the most recognisable sights was the kebab vendor. Standing beside a charcoal grill, he carefully turned skewers of lamb, liver, or minced meat over glowing coals. Fat dripped onto the fire with a satisfying hiss, sending clouds of fragrant smoke into the evening air. Customers gathered patiently, although patiently might be a generous description once the smell reached them. Few things weaken human dignity faster than perfectly grilled meat after 12 hours of physical labour. Nearby, another vendor stirred an enormous cauldron of chickpea stew that had been simmering since morning. Others served bowls of lentil soup to customers who stood eating with fresh bread in hand before returning to their evening errands. Simplicity often won over extravagance. A warm, filling meal mattered far more than elaborate presentation. Bread sellers continued making their rounds with baskets balanced expertly upon their heads. Fresh simit, covered with sesame seeds, disappeared almost as quickly as it emerged from the ovens. Children eagerly persuaded parents that one more ring of bread was absolutely essential for survival, a negotiating strategy that has remained remarkably consistent throughout history. Sweet vendors attracted an entirely different crowd. Large trays displayed sticky pieces of baklava layered with paper-thin pastry, crushed nuts, and fragrant syrup. Others sold lokma, small fried dough balls soaked in honey or syrup, often prepared for celebrations or charitable distributions. Halva, dense and satisfying, provided a sweet ending for those fortunate enough to enjoy it. Even people who insisted they were only looking somehow found themselves purchasing dessert a few moments later. Drink sellers added another layer to the bustling streetscape. Sherbet vendors carried large decorative containers filled with refreshing fruit drinks, flavoured with rose petals, tamarind, cherries, lemons, or violets. They poured bright, cooling beverages into metal cups with practised speed, offering welcome relief after a long day beneath the Anatolian sun. Coffee sellers occasionally appeared as well, though many customers preferred to visit one of the neighbourhood coffee houses later in the evening. For now, dinner remained the priority. The streets echoed with conversations in Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Ladino, Persian, and countless local dialects. Merchants bargained over tomorrow's deliveries while neighbours exchanged news, and children darted between adults, carefully avoiding donkeys that seemed permanently convinced they owned the road. Yet for all the tempting food available outdoors, the greatest meal of the evening was still waiting behind countless front doors, where families were gathering not simply to eat, but to spend precious hours together before another demanding day began. If there was one rule that united nearly every Ottoman neighbourhood, it was this: food nourished the body, but hospitality nourished the soul. A family's evening meal was never considered entirely private. At almost any moment, a knock at the door might announce a relative, a neighbour, a travelling merchant, or an unexpected guest. Rather than causing inconvenience, such visits were often welcomed as an opportunity to demonstrate generosity. There was an old belief repeated throughout the empire that a guest arrived with blessings. Refusing someone food without good reason reflected poorly on the household, regardless of whether the family possessed great wealth or very little. Even modest homes found ways to make another place at the sofra. The first gesture was simple but meaningful. The guest was invited inside, offered a comfortable cushion, and encouraged to relax before any food appeared. Shoes were often removed at the entrance to keep the home clean, especially in households where the family ate while seated close to the floor. Water was brought for washing hands, an important practice both for cleanliness and respect. Only after everyone had settled comfortably would the meal truly begin. The host usually encouraged the guest to eat first. This was not merely politeness. It reflected the belief that generosity honoured both the visitor and the family itself. Guests were frequently urged to take another serving, then another after that. Declining once was almost expected. Accepting immediately could appear slightly eager, while refusing forever risked disappointing the host. The safest approach was a graceful dance of modest refusal, followed by cheerful acceptance. Ottoman hospitality occasionally resembled diplomatic negotiations conducted with bowls of stew. Conversation flowed naturally around the meal. The day's business was discussed first. Merchants spoke of market prices, sailors described conditions at the harbour, craftsmen compared commissions, and farmers shared news of crops arriving from nearby villages. Politics entered the conversation as well, although wise diners usually measured their opinions carefully. The empire was vast, and walls occasionally proved better listeners than trusted friends. Children remained present throughout dinner, quietly absorbing these conversations. They learned manners not through formal lessons but by observation. They watched when to speak, when to remain silent, how to greet elders, and how to serve others before serving themselves. Good behaviour at the sofa reflected good character everywhere else. Respect for elders shaped the entire meal. The oldest family members often occupied the place of honour, and younger relatives listened when they shared memories or advice. Grandparents recounted stories from earlier decades, sometimes describing distant provinces they had visited, or remarkable events they had witnessed. For younger listeners, these tales transformed dinner into an evening lesson in history, family identity, and tradition. Laughter, however, was never absent. Neighbours teased one another over harmless rivalries. Children occasionally earned smiles by repeating amusing stories from the street. Even grandparents who appeared stern often revealed a surprisingly sharp sense of humour once everyone had eaten their fill. As the final pieces of bread disappeared and empty bowls were collected, dinner slowly gave way to another cherished part of the evening. Nobody rushed back to work. The meal was over, but the neighbourhood's night was only beginning. With the last bowls cleared and the bread wrapped carefully for tomorrow, the evening entered its second act. Dinner may have been finished, but few people hurried directly to bed. In a busy Ottoman neighbourhood, the hours after sunset belonged to conversation, community, and the simple pleasure of finally slowing down after a demanding day. The streets outside remained full of life. Oil lamps hanging above doorways cast warm pools of light onto the uneven stone lanes. Their glow reflected softly off whitewashed walls and polished copper trays carried home from the market. The heat of the afternoon had faded, replaced by a gentle evening breeze that drifted through the narrow alleys, carrying the lingering scent of grilled meat, fresh bread, and flowering jasmine from hidden courtyard gardens. Families often stepped outside together. Neighbours pulled wooden stools into the street or gathered on low benches beneath the shade of old plane trees. It was perfectly ordinary to spend an hour simply talking. News travelled quickly this way. Someone's daughter had become engaged. A merchant had returned from Damascus with exotic fabrics. A fisherman claimed this year's catch was unusually poor, although fishermen have made remarkably similar claims for thousands of years. Children reclaimed the streets almost immediately. Freed from the discipline of the dinner table, they chased one another between houses, played games with stones or carved wooden toys, and invented competitions whose rules changed whenever someone started losing. Their laughter echoed through the neighbourhood, while weary parents pretended not to notice the increasing volume, provided nothing valuable was broken. Older boys sometimes gathered around musicians carrying simple instruments. A reed flute, a frame drum, or the long-necked saz could easily attract a small audience. Songs ranged from cheerful village tunes to melancholy ballads telling stories of distant lovers, famous battles, or legendary heroes. Not every performer possessed extraordinary talent, but after a satisfying dinner, audiences generally became far more forgiving. Many men wandered toward the local coffee house. Contrary to popular imagination, coffee houses were not simply places to drink coffee. They functioned as neighbourhood gathering places where artisans, merchants, scholars and travellers exchanged ideas and stories. Cups of strong, dark coffee were served slowly, encouraging conversation rather than haste. Some men played backgammon or chess, while others listened to professional storytellers who captivated audiences with tales from Persian epics, adventures of Nasreddin Hoja, or accounts of Ottoman victories. Meanwhile, many women remained closer to home, visiting one another in courtyards or shared gardens. They exchanged recipes, discussed household matters, arranged future visits, embroidered textiles, or simply enjoyed a rare quiet hour after a full day's work. These evening gatherings strengthened friendships that often lasted a lifetime. Street vendors had not entirely disappeared either. A few still wandered through the neighbourhood selling roasted nuts, seasonal fruit, or small sweets to those who found that dinner had somehow left just enough room for one little snack. Human optimism about dessert, it seems, has always been wonderfully consistent. As conversations stretched into the night and lanterns flickered against the wooden facades, the neighbourhood revealed its greatest strength. It was not merely a collection of houses, but a living community, where daily life was shared as naturally as bread at the dinner table. And before the city finally surrendered to sleep, one final tradition remained waiting to complete the evening. As the conversations gradually slowed and the stars claimed more of the sky above the rooftops, the neighbourhood settled into one final ritual before sleep. Dinner itself had ended some time ago, yet few considered the evening complete without something small to finish the day. It was a quieter moment, one less about satisfying hunger and more about comfort, reflection, and the simple pleasures that made ordinary life enjoyable. In many homes, a tray appeared carrying tiny cups of coffee. Ottoman coffee had already become an important part of daily life by the 16th century, and preparing it properly was considered an art in itself. Finely ground coffee was simmered slowly in a small copper pot called a kesve, often over glowing charcoal rather than an open flame. There were no paper filters, no cream, and certainly no flavoured syrups with names longer than the drink itself. Just coffee, water, and patience. The result was rich, dark, and remarkably strong. It was poured carefully into small handleless cups, allowing the grounds to settle at the bottom. Nobody rushed through it. Coffee was meant to be sipped slowly, while conversation continued. Drinking it too quickly would have been rather like reading only the final page of a good novel. Alongside the coffee came sweets. Baklava often appeared during celebrations or in wealthier homes, its delicate layers of pastry hiding generous amounts of pistachios or walnuts beneath fragrant syrup. More ordinary evenings might feature halva, prepared from sesame paste or flour cooked gently with butter and sugar until it reached a smooth, comforting texture. Seasonal fruits such as figs, grapes, cherries, apricots or melons were equally welcome, providing a lighter end to the meal. Dried fruits also played an important role. Dates, raisins, and dried apricots could be stored throughout the year and offered natural sweetness without elaborate preparation. Nuts, such as almonds, hazelnuts, and pistachios, were passed around in small bowls, encouraging everyone to linger a little longer before retiring for the night. Some households enjoyed fragrant herbal infusions instead of coffee. Mint, sage, chamomile, rose hips, or mountain herbs gathered from nearby hillsides created gentle drinks believed to aid digestion after a hearty meal. Every family had its favourite mixture, usually accompanied by complete confidence that it was superior to every other family's recipe. Conversation during this part of the evening became calmer. The day's practical matters faded into the background. Instead, people shared old stories, family memories, local legends, and humorous observations. Children, now struggling to keep their eyes open, listened from nearby cushions as grandparents recounted tales of clever merchants, wandering dervishes, mischievous tricksters, or distant ancestors whose achievements somehow became slightly more impressive each time they were retold. Before the Mongols built the largest contiguous empire in history, before armies thundered across Asia and Europe, and before the name of Chinggis Khan inspired both admiration and terror, an ordinary evening on the steppe often began with something far less dramatic than a charging horse. It began with a wooden bowl. Inside that bowl was a cloudy, slightly fizzy drink called kumis, made from fermented mare's milk. To an outsider, it might not have looked particularly impressive. It certainly did not resemble the rich wines of Persia or the carefully aged beers brewed in Europe. Yet for the Mongols, kumis was far more than a beverage. It nourished families, welcomed strangers, sealed friendships, celebrated victories, and accompanied nearly every important moment of life. To understand the Mongols, you must first understand what they drank. Imagine yourself standing on the vast grasslands of Mongolia. There are no vineyards stretching across rolling hills, no orchards heavy with fruit, and no bustling taverns promising an endless variety of drinks. Instead, the landscape stretches almost endlessly in every direction. The horizon seems impossibly distant, interrupted only by grazing horses, scattered sheep, shaggy yaks in certain regions, and the occasional white felt ger standing proudly against the open sky. Life here depended entirely on animals. The Mongols measured wealth not by gold hidden in chests, but by the size and health of their herds. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, camels, and yaks provided transportation, clothing, shelter, fuel, and food. Even their drinks came from livestock. On the steppe, every useful resource walked on 4 legs. As evening approached, riders gradually returned to camp. Horses were unsaddled after long hours of grazing or travel. Dogs barked excitedly before recognizing familiar faces. Children raced between the gers while helping gather smaller animals into protective enclosures before darkness settled over the plains. From inside, the largest ger drifted the comforting smell of boiling meat and warm dairy. The family's home, surprisingly spacious beneath its circular wooden frame and thick felt covering, glowed softly from the central fire. Everything inside served a purpose. Saddles rested neatly against the walls. Bows and quivers hung within easy reach. Chests held clothing, tools, and treasured possessions accumulated over years of migration. Then someone reached for the bowl, not because a celebration had begun, not because a great victory had been won, simply because guests had arrived. Among the Mongols, offering food and drink came before nearly everything else. A traveller crossing hundreds of miles of open steppe depended upon the kindness of strangers for survival. Today, you might welcome someone into your home with a cup of tea. A Mongol family welcomed them with kumis. Refusing to offer it would have suggested poor manners. Refusing to accept it without good reason could be equally awkward. Hospitality was one of the invisible laws of the grasslands, as dependable as the changing seasons or the rising sun. The first bowl was never simply about quenching thirst. It announced peace instead of danger. It transformed strangers into guests. And before long, that single wooden bowl would become one of the most recognizable symbols of Mongol life across the greatest empire the world had ever seen. that welcoming bowl of kumis represented far more work than most guests ever realised. By the time it reached someone's hands, dozens of small tasks had already been completed, each depending on careful timing, experience, and perhaps a willingness to be kicked by a horse that had not yet finished breakfast. Unlike cows, mares cannot simply be milked whenever it is convenient. They produce milk only after giving birth, and even then, their foals must remain nearby to stimulate the flow of milk. Throughout the warmer months, when grass covered the steppe and the herds were healthiest, Mongol families followed a daily rhythm centred around these nursing mares. Milking took place several times each day. A foal was first allowed to nurse briefly before being gently pulled aside. The mare, now ready to release her milk, was carefully milked by hand into wooden buckets or leather containers. Speed mattered. Mare's milk flowed quickly, and experienced herders worked with remarkable efficiency before returning the foal to its mother. No drop was wasted. Compared with cow's milk, mare's milk contains more natural sugars and less fat, making it particularly suitable for fermentation. Fresh from the animal, it tasted surprisingly sweet and light, but fresh milk was only the beginning. The transformation into kumis required patience and constant attention. The milk was poured into a large leather bag, often made from horsehide, or into a tall wooden churn. Inside remained a small amount of older fermented kumis from the previous batch. This acted much like a sourdough starter, introducing natural yeasts and bacteria that would begin the fermentation process almost immediately. Then came perhaps the most important task: stirring, or rather, endless stirring. Every person in the household contributed. Adults, children, grandparents, and even visitors passing through camp might be asked to give the churn several vigorous strokes whenever they walked by. Some historical accounts describe the mixture being stirred hundreds or even thousands of times throughout the day. It became such an ordinary part of life that no one thought much about it. If your hands happened to be free, congratulations, you had just volunteered. This constant agitation mixed fresh milk with the fermenting liquid while preventing the cream from separating. Gradually, naturally occurring yeasts converted some of the milk sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide. By evening, the once sweet milk had developed a pleasantly sour flavour with a gentle fizz and a modest alcoholic content, usually only a few %. The exact taste varied enormously. A family's kumis depended on the health of its mares, the weather, the temperature, the age of the starter culture, and the skill of whoever managed the fermentation. Every household insisted theirs was excellent. Their neighbours occasionally disagreed, usually after accepting a second bowl. Fresh kumis was considered best. Unlike wine, it was not intended for long-term aging. Families produced it continuously throughout the milking season, creating a fresh supply almost every day. During the harsh winters, however, mares produced little or no milk, so kumis became scarce. People then relied more heavily on other dairy products such as dried curds, yogurt, butter, and fermented drinks made from cows, sheep's, or camel's milk, depending on the region. By the end of summer, one thing had become clear. Kumis was not simply a drink made by one person. It was the product of an entire household working together, a daily tradition woven into the rhythm of life on the endless steppe. By now, the leather churn had done its work, and the fresh kumis was ready to drink. Unlike many beverages that appeared only during festivals or special occasions, kumis belonged to everyday life. It was not reserved for kings, warriors, or honoured guests. Rich or poor, young or old, nearly every Mongol family consumed some form of fermented dairy almost every single day. On the open steppe, that made perfect sense. The Mongols lived in an environment where survival depended upon mobility. Their homes could be dismantled within hours. Their wealth grazed across endless grasslands. Their lives followed the seasons rather than permanent settlements. Under these conditions, fresh fruit juices, vineyards, or grain-based beers were simply impractical. Livestock provided nearly everything a family required, including what they drank. A typical morning often began with dairy. After tending the animals and checking the herds, family members drank bowls of fresh or lightly fermented milk before setting out on the day's work. Riders heading off to inspect distant grazing lands, hunters tracking game, and shepherds moving flocks all carried nourishment that came directly from their animals. Kumis was particularly valued because it was surprisingly nutritious. It contained protein, vitamins, beneficial bacteria from fermentation, and enough calories to sustain people through long hours of physical activity. While it could not replace every meal, it served as both food and drink, especially during the warmer months when mares produced abundant milk. Travellers frequently noticed how often bowls were refilled. One bowl rarely remained the last. A visitor might receive another before finishing the first, followed by another after conversation began. Declining politely was acceptable after a reasonable amount, but accepting at least one serving demonstrated respect for the household offering it. Children also consumed fermented dairy, although not always the stronger batches intended for adults. Fresh milk, lightly fermented drinks, yogurt, and various dairy products formed an essential part of their diet from an early age. Older family members often preferred slightly more mature kumis, whose sharper flavour reflected a longer fermentation. Water, surprisingly, was not always the safest choice. Many streams remained clean on the open steppe, but stagnant pools or heavily used watering places could become contaminated by animals. Fermentation reduced certain harmful microorganisms, making drinks like kumis a dependable source of hydration in many situations. While the Mongols certainly drank water whenever it was available and clean, fermented dairy often provided a safer and more nutritious alternative. Seasonal change shaped everything. During spring and summer, fresh kumis flowed in abundance as mares produced milk for their foals. Families could enjoy newly fermented batches every day, and surplus milk became butter, cheese, dried curds, or other preserved foods. Winter transformed the menu entirely. Once the mares stopped producing milk, kumis virtually disappeared until the following spring. Instead, households relied upon foods prepared during the warmer months. Dried dairy products could be stored for remarkable lengths of time, while butter and hard cheeses provided valuable nutrition throughout the freezing season. Cows, sheep, goats, or camels' milk, depending on the region, also became more important. For the Mongols, this changing cycle never felt unusual. It simply reflected the rhythm of the steppe itself. Every season offered different gifts, and every family adapted accordingly. But no matter what filled the bowls, one tradition remained constant. If a stranger appeared on the horizon and rode toward the camp, the very first thing placed into their hands would almost certainly be something to drink. As important as kumis was to everyday life, its greatest purpose was revealed the moment a stranger appeared on the horizon. Imagine riding for hours across the endless Mongolian steppe. There are no villages every few miles, no roadside inns, and certainly no convenient signs promising hot meals just ahead. The landscape rolls endlessly beneath the sky, beautiful but unforgiving. A sudden storm, an injured horse, or simply taking the wrong valley could leave a traveller dangerously isolated. Then, in the distance, you spot a cluster of white gers. For a Mongol traveller, few sights were more comforting. As you approach, the family has probably noticed you long before you reached them. The open steppe offers very few surprises. Riders can often be seen from several miles away, giving everyone ample time to wonder whether the newcomer is a merchant, messenger, neighbouring herder, or perhaps someone carrying news from far beyond the next mountain range. Whatever the answer, custom demanded one thing above all else. A guest must be welcomed. Hospitality among the Mongols was not simply considered good manners, it was a practical necessity for survival. Every family understood that someday they themselves might depend upon the kindness of strangers. Today you offered shelter, tomorrow you might be the one asking for it. As you dismount, someone usually steps forward to take your horse, or at least help secure the reins. You are invited toward the entrance of the Jur without endless questioning. Contrary to what modern films sometimes suggest, nobody immediately demands your identity while dramatically pointing a spear at your chest. First came hospitality. Questions could wait until everyone was comfortable. Before entering, you avoid stepping directly on the threshold. This wooden doorway carried symbolic importance, and standing or stamping on it was considered disrespectful. Once inside, another unwritten rule immediately comes into play. Do not lean against the central support columns. These pillars held up the entire roof and symbolised the stability of the household itself. Treating them carelessly was seen as deeply impolite. Likewise, guests avoided wandering aimlessly around the interior. Every space inside the circular home had its purpose, and experienced travellers understood these invisible boundaries without needing anyone to explain them. Soon a wooden bowl appears. It is filled with fresh kumis. The host offers it with both hands, a gesture of respect that deserves an equally respectful response. The guest accepts the bowl carefully, usually with the right hand supported by the left, or with both hands together. Taking a generous sip acknowledges both the drink and the generosity behind it. Simply refusing without good reason could create awkwardness. After all, the family was offering one of its most valuable foods to someone it had never met. Once the first bowl had been shared, conversation finally began. Where had you travelled from? How were the grazing lands farther east? Had you encountered wolves, bandits, or an approaching caravan? News spread across the steppe one rider at a time, carried not through written newspapers, but through bowls of fermented mare's milk shared between strangers. By the time the conversation ended, the guest was no longer merely a traveller. For one evening at least, they had become part of the household. And when that household celebrated a wedding, welcomed a new child, or honoured a great victory, those simple bowls of kumis became something even more meaningful than hospitality. They became part of ceremonies that strengthened the bonds of the entire Mongol world. Once a guest had been welcomed and the first bowls of kumis had been shared, the gathering could become something much greater than an ordinary meal. For the Mongols, drinking was not only about refreshment or hospitality. During important occasions, every bowl carried meaning, every gesture followed tradition, and every shared drink strengthened the invisible bonds that held families, clans, and even the empire together. Many ceremonies began before anyone took the first proper sip. Instead, a small amount of kumis was offered to the world itself. A few drops might be flicked into the air with the ring finger, scattered toward the ground, or cast toward the four directions. These simple acts honoured Tengri, the eternal blue sky, as well as the spirits of the earth and the ancestors who had watched over previous generations. The offering acknowledged that prosperity did not belong entirely to human beings. The grasslands, the horses, the weather, and good fortune were gifts that deserved gratitude. Only after this symbolic offering did the drinking begin. Unlike elaborate court rituals elsewhere in the medieval world, Mongol ceremonies often appeared surprisingly simple. There were no golden temples filled with incense or endless lines of priests reciting complicated formulas. Instead, the rituals reflected the straightforward life of the steppe. A family gathered inside a ger. A respected elder spoke a few thoughtful words, bowls were raised, and everyone drank together. At weddings, kumis flowed generously. The joining of two families was celebrated with feasting, horse racing, wrestling, music, and generous hospitality. Bowls passed from hand to hand as relatives toasted the health of the bride and groom, wished them many healthy children, and hoped their herds would multiply with each passing year. On the Mongolian steppe, wishing someone prosperity usually involved livestock rather than enormous castles. 1,000 healthy horses could be worth far more than a palace. Births were also marked with shared drinks and communal celebration. When a child survived the dangerous first months of life, family and neighbours gathered to celebrate another future rider joining the clan. Elders offered blessings, hoping the child would grow into a skilled horseman, wise leader, or capable herder. Victories brought their own ceremonies. When warriors returned successfully from a campaign or hunting expedition, the camp celebrated together. Kumis circulated freely, while stories of bravery grew steadily more impressive with every bowl. A rider who had merely frightened away 3 wolves by sunset might, by the end of the evening, have personally negotiated their surrender. Fermentation has always possessed a remarkable talent for improving storytelling. Even political gatherings relied heavily on ceremonial drinking. When clan leaders met to settle disputes or forge alliances, shared bowls of kumis helped establish trust before serious discussions began. Agreements reached after eating and drinking together carried greater weight than conversations held between strangers. Hospitality softened suspicion, allowing negotiations to begin on common ground rather than mutual fear. Foreign ambassadors quickly discovered these customs as well. Visitors from China, Persia, Rus, and Europe often found themselves participating in Mongol drinking ceremonies. Some embraced the experience enthusiastically. Others struggled with the unfamiliar sour taste of fermented mare's milk, while politely pretending they enjoyed every swallow. Diplomatic success occasionally depended less on eloquent speeches than on maintaining a cheerful expression through another generous serving of kumis. By the time the final toast had been offered, everyone understood that these ceremonies celebrated far more than a drink. They celebrated loyalty, friendship, gratitude, and shared identity across the vast grasslands. And nowhere were these traditions displayed more spectacularly than at the magnificent feasts hosted by the great Khans themselves. The family gatherings inside an ordinary ger revealed the heart of Mongol hospitality, but the feasts held by the great Khans elevated those same traditions to an extraordinary scale. Everything became larger. More guests arrived, more horses grazed outside, more fires burned across the camp, and far more bowls of kumis circulated from dawn until well after sunset. Yet despite the grandeur, the principles remained surprisingly familiar. A guest was still welcomed before being questioned, food still came before politics, and no important gathering truly began until drinks had been shared. When Chinggis Khan united the Mongol tribes in the early 13th century, he inherited the customs of the steppe rather than replacing them. His court travelled with him across the grasslands, living in enormous royal camps made up of hundreds or even thousands of gers. Rather than building permanent palaces, the empire's rulers often carried their capital wherever they went. Visitors were frequently astonished by what they found. Foreign ambassadors from Persia, China, Rus, and later Europe expected rough nomads living simple lives. Instead, they encountered remarkably organised encampments capable of feeding enormous numbers of people. The royal ger stood at the centre, surrounded by nobles, military commanders, craftsmen, servants, guards, and endless lines of horses stretching across the plains. During major celebrations, the camp transformed into something resembling a moving city. huge cauldrons simmered with mutton and horse meat. Entire sheep roasted over open fires, while attendants hurried between guests carrying wooden bowls, silver cups, and leather containers filled with fresh kumis. Musicians played horsehead fiddles, flutes, and drums as singers performed heroic epics celebrating legendary ancestors and recent victories. Kumis remained the drink of honour. Servants moved constantly through the gathering, ensuring bowls were never empty for long. Important guests were expected to drink alongside the Khan, an act that symbolised friendship and mutual respect. Declining too often could be interpreted as rejecting the goodwill being offered, although wise hosts also understood that foreign visitors were sometimes unfamiliar with the drink's sharp, sour flavour. As the Mongol Empire expanded, however, something new appeared alongside the traditional bowls. Wine arrived from Persia, rice wine came from China, grape wines travelled from Central Asia. Even strong distilled drinks occasionally reached the imperial court through trade and conquest. The Mongols proved remarkably curious about foreign customs and rarely rejected something simply because it originated elsewhere. The great Khans embraced this growing variety. Historical accounts describe lavish banquets where imported wines stood beside traditional kumis, allowing guests from distant lands to enjoy familiar drinks while still participating in Mongol hospitality. These feasts became powerful diplomatic tools. Sharing food and drink created an atmosphere where alliances could be negotiated, tribute accepted, disputes resolved, and loyalty rewarded. Of course, such enormous celebrations also produced the occasional excess. Some guests drank far more enthusiastically than wisely. Even Mongol chronicles acknowledge that certain rulers developed a taste for heavy drinking later in the empire's history. Foreign observers likewise recorded banquets, where the cups seemed to circulate endlessly, and where maintaining graceful composure became increasingly difficult as the evening progressed. Still, beneath all the spectacle, these imperial feasts remained rooted in the same tradition practiced by ordinary herding families across the steppe. Whether inside a humble jur or the magnificent camp of a great Khan, offering a drink was never simply about filling a bowl. It was about honouring the guest, strengthening trust, and reminding everyone gathered that for one evening they shared not only a meal, but a common table beneath the eternal blue sky. If the feasts of the great Khans demonstrated the power and prestige of the Mongol Empire, they also revealed something much more human. Once the formal ceremonies had ended and the serious negotiations were complete, the atmosphere often relaxed considerably. Music grew louder, stories became funnier, and bowls of kumis continued making their endless journey from one pair of hands to another. The Mongols certainly knew how to celebrate. A successful hunting expedition, the birth of a child, a wedding, the return of warriors from campaign, or the gathering of distant relatives could all become reasons for an evening of laughter and shared drink. Life on the steppe was demanding and often dangerous. Moments of celebration were not taken for granted. Entertainment came in many forms. Musicians played the morin khur, the famous horsehead fiddle, whose haunting melodies echoed across the open plains. Singers performed long heroic epics, sometimes lasting for hours, recounting the deeds of legendary ancestors and famous warriors. Skilled storytellers held audiences spellbound with tales that blended history, folklore, and just enough exaggeration to keep everyone awake. And naturally, drinking encouraged participation. Guests challenged one another to singing contests, recited poetry, or competed to remember long genealogies stretching back through generations of clan history. Among nomadic societies where history was preserved orally, an excellent memory was deeply respected. A person who could recount family lineages or heroic traditions accurately earned genuine admiration. Friendly competitions also appeared. Wrestlers demonstrated their strength outside the camp. Archers compared their accuracy. Riders boasted about the speed of their horses. These contests often continued during celebrations, with bowls of kumis waiting afterward for both victors and defeated competitors alike. Before they signed declarations, argued over constitutions, or debated the future of a nation that did not yet exist, America's founding fathers had something much more immediate to think about: getting out of bed. History often freezes these men inside grand oil paintings, dressed in powdered wigs and solemn expressions, as though they spent every waking hour inventing democracy. In reality, most mornings began far more quietly. A rooster crowed somewhere outside. Servants and labourers were already beginning their work. Fireplaces crackled back to life after the night's chill, and another ordinary day slowly unfolded across the American colonies. Imagine the sun rising over Mount Vernon. George Washington was famously an early riser. During much of his adult life, he preferred to wake before sunrise, especially when at home. Rather than lingering indoors, he often stepped outside almost immediately, inspecting fields, stables, gardens, fences and livestock before breakfast. Running a plantation demanded constant attention. Crops refused to grow simply because their owner had become a famous general. A few hundred miles away, Thomas Jefferson's morning followed a different rhythm. Jefferson loved reading almost as much as breathing. Before much of the household had fully awakened, he might already be studying architecture, philosophy, agriculture, science, or classical literature. His curiosity seemed almost limitless. If someone had published a 200-page book explaining the proper way to organize a vegetable garden, Jefferson probably wanted a copy before lunch. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin often approached the day with deliberate purpose. He famously asked himself each morning, "What good shall I do this day?" It was part of the personal discipline he developed throughout his life. Franklin valued routine, organization, and constant self-improvement. He also enjoyed reminding people that wasting time was remarkably easy. Judging by modern habits of endlessly checking glowing screens, he might conclude humanity has become exceptionally talented at it. John Adams preferred activity over idleness as well. Whether practicing law, writing letters, or managing family affairs, Adams disliked wasting the valuable hours of the morning. His correspondence reveals a man constantly thinking, planning, and worrying, sometimes all before breakfast. Coffee had not yet become the unstoppable force it would later become in American life, but one suspects Adams would have appreciated a larger cup. Despite their different personalities, these men shared remarkably ordinary responsibilities. They managed farms, supervised workers, balanced household finances, answered letters, cared for their families, and dealt with repairs that never seemed to end. Roofs leaked, horses lost shoes, fences collapsed, deliveries arrived late. Even future presidents occasionally discovered that owning property meant spending an unreasonable amount of time discussing timber. Their homes reflected this balance between comfort and responsibility. Some lived in elegant houses filled with books, maps, scientific instruments, and imported furniture. Others spent long periods travelling between courts, legislative assemblies, and family estates. Yet wherever they lived, the household itself functioned through the work of wives, children, servants, hired labourers, and, particularly in the southern colonies, enslaved people whose forced labour sustained many of these prosperous estates. The daily routines of several founding fathers cannot be understood honestly without recognising this reality. As the morning sun climbed higher, breakfast tables were prepared, horses saddled, letters sealed with wax, and visitors began arriving at the front door. politics could wait another hour. For now, these famous men were simply beginning another ordinary day, unaware that history would one day remember almost every decision they were about to make. As the morning routines gave way to the day's work, the Founding Fathers turned their attention to something that occupied far more of their time than speeches or political debates: their homes. For most of them, home was not simply a place to sleep. It was a business, a workplace, a family centre, and in many cases, an enormous logistical challenge. Before they could help govern a country, they first had to manage farms, plantations, libraries, workshops, finances, and dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people whose lives revolved around the estate. George Washington's Mount Vernon covered thousands of acres overlooking the Potomac River. Contrary to the image of a gentleman leisurely strolling through flower gardens all day, Washington treated the estate almost like a modern company. Nearly every morning included inspections of fields, livestock, fences, barns, mills, and workshops. He kept remarkably detailed records, noting crop yields, weather conditions, livestock breeding, expenses and repairs with almost obsessive precision. Nothing escaped his attention for long. If a gate needed repairing, he wanted to know. If wheat production declined, he investigated why. If one of his horses became ill, it appeared in his journals alongside discussions of national affairs. Running Mount Vernon required constant management, and Washington genuinely enjoyed solving practical problems. Thomas Jefferson approached his home quite differently. Monticello reflected his endless curiosity. Perched atop a Virginia hill, the house became a lifelong project. Jefferson redesigned rooms, experimented with architecture, invented clever mechanical devices, collected books by the thousands, and filled the estate with gardens, vineyards, orchards, and experimental crops. Visitors often remarked that walking through Monticello felt almost like touring the mind of its owner. If Washington managed an estate like a disciplined businessman, Jefferson approached one like an inventor who simply happened to own a mountain. John Adams lived a far less extravagant life at Peacefield in Massachusetts. His property was smaller and more practical, fitting his personality. Adams genuinely enjoyed farming, and often found physical labour refreshing after months spent dealing with politics. Working outdoors gave him a welcome escape from endless arguments, and he frequently admitted that tending orchards or walking his fields felt considerably less exhausting than attending another legislative session. Benjamin Franklin's Philadelphia home reflected yet another lifestyle. Unlike the Virginia planters, Franklin lived in a busy city surrounded by printers, merchants, craftsmen, and scholars. His house contained scientific instruments, books, experiments, maps, and inventions in various stages of completion. One room might contain electrical equipment, while another held printing materials or correspondence arriving from Europe. Franklin's home resembled the workshop of a man who found nearly everything interesting. Despite these differences, all these households shared one uncomfortable reality. Their comfort depended upon the labour of many other people. In the northern states, servants and hired workers commonly maintained homes and farms. In the south, however, estates such as Mount Vernon and Monticello relied heavily upon the forced labour of enslaved men, women, and children. They planted crops, prepared meals, cared for livestock, built fences, cleaned houses, and performed countless tasks that allowed these households to function every single day. This contradiction sat at the centre of early American life. Several founding fathers wrote passionately about liberty, while simultaneously benefiting from slavery. Some wrestled privately with this conflict, others defended the institution, and a few gradually changed their views over time. It remains one of the most enduring and difficult realities of their legacy As the day's work continued across fields, workshops, kitchens, and libraries, another routine slowly approached. Soon the households would gather for their first proper meal of the day, revealing what America's future founders actually ate and drank when history was not watching. By late morning, after inspecting fields, answering letters, meeting visitors, or managing their estates, the founding fathers were ready for something much less famous than drafting declarations. Breakfast. It was rarely an extravagant affair. Despite popular imagination, most 18th century Americans did not begin the day with towering stacks of pancakes drowning in maple syrup. The breakfast table reflected practicality rather than indulgence, especially in households where a full day's work still lay ahead. Fresh bread appeared almost every morning. Loaves baked from wheat or rye were served alongside butter, preserves, or local honey. Cornmeal, one of colonial America's staple foods, frequently became porridge or johnny cakes cooked on a griddle. Eggs were common whenever hens cooperated, which, like modern office printers, could never be entirely trusted to perform consistently. Ham, smoked bacon, or salt pork often completed the meal. Families living near rivers or the coast sometimes enjoyed smoked fish instead. Seasonal fruit appeared whenever available, while apples remained one of the colony's most dependable crops. During winter, dried apples, preserved peaches, and jars of fruit preserves helped brighten otherwise plain meals. The drinks varied almost as much as the food. Tea remained enormously popular despite its association with Britain after the famous Boston Tea Party. Many Americans gradually shifted toward coffee, though tea never disappeared entirely. Hot chocolate, prepared from imported cacao, also found its place on wealthier breakfast tables, especially in larger cities like Philadelphia. George Washington reportedly preferred tea during much of his life, while Thomas Jefferson developed an affection for coffee after spending years in France. Benjamin Franklin seemed perfectly content with either, provided good conversation accompanied the cup. Alcohol also appeared more frequently than modern audiences might expect. Hard cider was perhaps the most common drink in colonial America. Nearly every farming community produced apples, making cider inexpensive and widely available. Beer brewed from barley or other grains was equally familiar. These beverages were often weaker than many modern versions, and could sometimes be safer than questionable water supplies, particularly in crowded towns. Dinner, which was usually eaten in the early afternoon rather than the evening, became the largest meal of the day. Large platters of roasted beef, mutton, pork, turkey, or chicken occupied the centre of the table, accompanied by potatoes, cabbage, carrots, squash, peas, beans, and fresh bread. Soups and stews stretched ingredients economically, while providing hearty meals capable of feeding large households. At Mount Vernon, Washington took genuine interest in agriculture and often experimented with new crops and livestock. His estate produced much of what appeared on the family's table. Jefferson shared this enthusiasm, cultivating vegetables, herbs, fruits, and vineyards at Monticello, while eagerly collecting recipes from Europe. One luxury stood above nearly every other: Madeira wine. Imported from the Portuguese island of Madeira, this fortified wine became the favourite drink of many colonial gentlemen. It travelled exceptionally well across the Atlantic, and appeared regularly during formal dinners and important gatherings. Jefferson admired French wines, but Madeira remained one of the defining beverages of the revolutionary generation. Meals themselves were social occasions. Family members, guests, business associates, and travellers frequently gathered around the same table. Discussions ranged from farming techniques and weather to philosophy, literature, science, and occasionally politics. Although once political debates began, there was always a slight risk that dessert might arrive before everyone agreed on anything. When the meal finally ended, however, nobody disappeared for an afternoon nap. Instead, another essential part of their daily lives resumed: writing letters, maintaining friendships, and carrying on conversations that stretched across the 13 colonies and eventually helped shape an entirely new nation. Once dinner had ended and the business of the estate was under control, the founding fathers often turned to one of the most important parts of their daily lives: writing letters. In an age without telephones, telegraphs, or electronic messages arriving every 30 seconds, a carefully written letter served as the lifeline connecting friends separated by hundreds of miles. These men did not simply exchange political opinions. They discussed family, health, farming, books, scientific discoveries, finances, personal disappointments, and occasionally complained about the weather with a dedication that would impress even the most enthusiastic small-talk expert. Some wrote constantly. John Adams and his wife Abigail exchanged well over 1,000 letters during their marriage, particularly when politics kept them apart for months or even years. Their correspondence reveals affection, humour, frustration, and genuine partnership. Abigail frequently offered political observations of her own, while John shared his worries, hopes, and the exhausting realities of public life. Reading their letters today feels remarkably modern. One day they discussed the future of the colonies. The next, they worried about sick children, broken fences, troublesome finances, or whether certain seeds would grow properly that season. History may remember John Adams as a revolutionary leader, but much of his time was spent dealing with problems familiar to almost every homeowner. Thomas Jefferson maintained an equally extraordinary correspondence. Over his lifetime, he wrote thousands upon thousands of letters, covering nearly every subject imaginable. Friends sought his advice on architecture, education, agriculture, philosophy, law, politics, gardening, music, and inventions. Jefferson seemed convinced that if someone asked an interesting question, it deserved an equally thoughtful answer. Benjamin Franklin may have enjoyed letter writing more than anyone. Living for long periods in London and Paris, Franklin maintained friendships across Europe and America with astonishing ease. His wit appeared naturally on the page, and even ordinary letters often contained amusing observations or clever advice. Franklin possessed the rare ability to sound both deeply intelligent and pleasantly conversational at the same time. The friendships between these men were often surprisingly warm. Washington and Henry Knox shared genuine affection developed during the hardships of the Revolutionary War. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson became lifelong intellectual companions, exchanging ideas that influenced both American government and their personal lives. Even fierce political rivals occasionally maintained private respect despite public disagreements. Not every friendship survived intact. The relationship between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson provides perhaps the best example. Once close allies during the Revolution, political divisions eventually turned them into bitter rivals. For years, they barely communicated. Yet in retirement, encouraged by mutual friends, they resumed writing to one another. The result became one of history's greatest collections of correspondence. Their letters no longer focused solely on politics. Instead, two aging revolutionaries reflected on philosophy, religion, old age, history, friendship, and the astonishing changes they had witnessed during their lifetimes. It was less a political debate than an ongoing conversation between two men who had shared extraordinary experiences. Visitors also filled their afternoons. Neighbours stopped by unexpectedly. Travelling merchants brought news from distant towns. Foreign diplomats arrived carrying reports from Europe. Scholars discussed books. Young politicians sought advice. Hospitality remained an important part of colonial society, and few guests left without being offered refreshments and conversation. As evening slowly approached, the day's work gave way to quieter pleasures. The letters were sealed with wax, the books returned to their shelves, and family members gradually gathered once again, not for debate or diplomacy, but for the simple routines that made these remarkable men feel most at home. As the final visitors departed, and the day's correspondence came to an end, the pace of life began to slow. The urgency of business faded with the afternoon sunlight, replaced by something the Founding Fathers valued just as much as productive work. An evening at home, history often remembers these men standing in crowded assembly halls or delivering speeches before eager audiences. Far less attention is given to the countless evenings they spent surrounded by family, reading beside a fireplace, walking through gardens, or simply enjoying a few peaceful hours before another demanding day. For George Washington, evenings at Mount Vernon followed a comfortable rhythm. After dinner, he often took a stroll around the estate with Martha Washington, checking the gardens or enjoying the view across the Potomac River. He appreciated routine and disliked unnecessary extravagance. Once indoors, he might spend time reading newspapers arriving from Philadelphia or Europe, reviewing farm records, or playing cards with family and guests. Card games were among his favourite pastimes. Games like whist provided entertainment without requiring endless conversation. Washington was known to enjoy friendly competition, although even at the card table, he maintained the calm discipline that had become one of his defining characteristics. Losing a hand rarely disturbed him nearly as much as discovering that one of his fences had once again collapsed. Thomas Jefferson's evenings reflected his endlessly curious mind. If politics allowed him a quiet night, he often disappeared into his library. Books surrounded him everywhere. He read history, science, mathematics, philosophy, architecture, literature, and ancient languages with astonishing enthusiasm. His collection eventually grew into one of the largest personal libraries in America, and later formed the foundation of the Library of Congress after the original Congressional Library was destroyed during the War of 1812. Music also filled Jefferson's evenings. An accomplished violinist, he frequently played for family and guests. Music, in his view, was not simply entertainment, but an essential part of a well-rounded education. Visitors often described evenings at Monticello, where conversation flowed naturally between readings, performances, and thoughtful discussion. John Adams preferred quieter pleasures. Back at Peacefield, he often walked through his orchards before sunset, reflecting on the day's events. Later, he and Abigail spent hours talking together or reading aloud from books they both enjoyed. Their marriage was built upon genuine companionship, and even after decades together, they remained one another's closest confidants. Benjamin Franklin, meanwhile, rarely allowed an evening to pass without learning something new, whether conducting scientific experiments, discussing philosophy with friends, or attending gatherings filled with lively conversation. Franklin delighted in exchanging ideas. He believed curiosity should never retire, regardless of age. His evenings often resembled informal salons where politics mixed freely with science, humour, inventions, and practical advice. Family life occupied these hours as well. Children practiced reading or writing, while parents supervised lessons. Grandchildren listened to stories from earlier generations. Guests sometimes remained overnight, particularly if poor weather or darkness made travel unsafe. Colonial hospitality encouraged people to stay rather than risk dangerous roads after sunset. Candles and fireplaces provided the only reliable light. Once the flames burned low, the household naturally grew quieter. Reading became more difficult, conversation softened, and one by one family members retired to their bedrooms. Tomorrow would bring more letters, more responsibilities, and perhaps another political crisis. But for a few peaceful hours each evening, America's future founders were simply husbands, fathers, grandfathers, neighbours, and friends, enjoying the ordinary comforts of home before history came knocking at their doors once again. By the time the evening meal had ended and the letters were safely tucked away, one might imagine the founding fathers finally relaxing with nothing more demanding than a good book. Sometimes they did. More often, however, they found ways to stay remarkably busy. These men believed that an active mind deserved an active body. Their favourite pastimes varied widely, revealing personalities far more colourful than the solemn portraits hanging in museums might suggest. George Washington rarely enjoyed sitting still for very long. Throughout his life, horseback riding remained one of his greatest pleasures. He was widely considered one of the finest horsemen in the colonies, spending countless hours riding across Mount Vernon to inspect fields, supervise improvements, or simply enjoy the Virginia countryside. Riding was not merely transportation. It was exercise, recreation, and occasionally the only reliable opportunity to think without interruption. Washington also developed a reputation as an enthusiastic fox hunter. Long before dawn during hunting season, he gathered with friends, mounted his favourite horse, and followed packs of hounds across forests and open fields. The chase demanded endurance, skill, and excellent riding ability. Whether or not the fox appreciated participating in the tradition remains absent from the historical record. Thomas Jefferson preferred quieter hobbies. Gardening became one of his lifelong passions. At Monticello, he experimented constantly with vegetables, fruit trees, herbs, flowers, and exotic plants collected from around the world. He carefully documented which varieties flourished in Virginia's climate and eagerly exchanged seeds with friends in America and Europe. Jefferson also loved architecture. He spent years sketching buildings, redesigning rooms, and studying the proportions of classical Greek and Roman structures. Few homeowners today would spend decades redesigning their own house simply because they had another interesting idea. Jefferson considered this perfectly reasonable. Benjamin Franklin's hobbies reflected his endless curiosity. One week, he might be studying electricity. The next, he experimented with efficient heating stoves, improved musical instruments, swimming techniques, or weather patterns. Franklin approached the world as though it were one enormous puzzle waiting to be solved. Retirement never truly existed in his vocabulary. One of his favourite forms of exercise was swimming. Franklin became such an accomplished swimmer that he invented wooden hand paddles to increase speed through the water. He even suggested swimming should become part of every young person's education, proving that long before fitness influencers existed, Franklin was already encouraging people to exercise. John Adams found peace in simpler routines. Walking became one of his favourite daily habits. Whether crossing his orchards, inspecting stone walls, or wandering country roads near Peacefield, Adams valued the opportunity to think in silence. He often reflected that physical labour and fresh air provided a welcome cure for the endless frustrations of politics. Social gatherings offered another escape. Friends visited for dinner, card games, music, dancing, or conversation that deliberately avoided government whenever possible. Not every evening revolved around constitutions and treaties. Sometimes people simply laughed, shared stories, debated literature, or exchanged harmless gossip about neighbours whose chickens had once again wandered somewhere they clearly did not belong. Even the most influential men in early America occasionally needed a break from changing history, and perhaps nowhere did they find greater comfort than within their own families, where titles mattered far less than relationships, and where the greatest challenges often involved raising children rather than building a nation. After the letters had been written, the gardens inspected, and the evening conversations began to quiet, the founding fathers stepped into roles that rarely appear in history books. They became husbands. They became fathers. They became grandfathers.